My name is Jisoo Kim. I'm the director of the GW Institute for Korean Studies, and I'm also the Korea Foundation Associate Professor of History, International Affairs, and East Asian Languages and Literatures. Welcome to the first Premodern Korean lecture series of this academic year. We're very delighted to have Professor Roux with us today. I think since we began this Premodern Korea lecture series, I think P. Emmanuel, you're the first scholar that we invited from Europe. We hope to invite more going forward. Actually, Barbara Walls will be talking in the spring, so she's also from the University of Copenhagen. But we are trying to kind of expand in inviting scholars from different parts of the world who's doing pre-modern Korean studies. All right, so Dr. Pierre-Emmanuel Roux is an associate professor of East Asian history at Université Paris Cité. He is in the circulation. He's interested in the circulation of legal and religious knowledge in East Asia from the 17th to the 19th century. He's the author of 3 monographs in French: The Cross, the Whale, and the Canon: French Policy Towards Korea in the Mid-19th Century, published in 2012. The Living Hells, or the Illustrated Tragedy of Chinese Coolies in Cuba and Peru, published in 2018. And at the Tribunal of Repentance, The Prohibition of Catholicism in China, 1724 to 1860, published in 2023. He also serves as the chief editor of the French scholarly journal Extreme Orient, Extreme Occident, and he's currently working on a book project tentatively entitled Andreas Kim Taegån, The Clandestine Life and Heroic Afterlife of the First Korean Catholic Priest. So I believe his presentation today is going to be on Andreas Kim Taegån, and I'd be very much looking forward to learning from his talk today. All right, without further ado, I'll pass it on to Professor Roux.
Many thanks, dear Jisoo, for this kind introductions. I will now share my screen. Well, thanks again for inviting me. As you mentioned it, I'm very honored to be the first European to virtually cross the Atlantic and start this Premodern Korean lecture series this semester. And speaking of this Premodern Korean series, those of you who attended previous talks may remember the name of Andreas or Andrew Kim Taegån. Dr. Franklin Roux indeed gave a very interesting lecture here precisely 1 year ago in September 2022 with the title The Famous and the Nameless, The Lives and Afterlives of Chosōn Catholic Martyrs. In his lecture, Dr. Roux presented one famous saint and martyr, Kim Taegån, who is remembered as the first Korean Catholic priest, a martyr and a saint. So in other words, Kim Taegån has the most perfect CV for a Korean Catholic of the Chosōn period. Kim Taegån is also the key figure of my presentation today because I'm working on a biography of Kim Taegån, but I hopefully am not going to make the same lecture as Dr. Roux did last year. Nevertheless, I'm going to start my own talk with a follow-up to Dr. Roch's lecture. Kim Taegån is not just a famous saint, he is the most famous saint in Korea. In paintings of the Korean Catholic saints, he always stands at the middle. Also, and this is quite interesting in terms of dates, in the Catholic calendar, today, September 20th, is precisely the first date of Kim Taegån and other Catholic martyrs. As you can see here, Kim Taegån is listed first. So it's Kim Taegån and his companions. Let me give you another example and invite you for a 30 seconds journey to the Vatican City. It is an example that Dr. Roux could not have given last year because exactly 4 days ago, on September 16th, a new statue was inaugurated in the famous St. Peter's Basilica. It is actually quite rare to inaugurate a new statue in this basilica, since, as you can imagine, there is no much space for that anymore. But it happened 4 days ago. And this new statue represents Kim Taegån, so it's a 3.8 meters high statue. And more importantly, this is the very first statue of an East Asian martyr or saint standing in the Vatican. So this example, but there are many others, shows you that Kim Taegån is not just a Korean Catholic saint. He is on the road to become an international superstar in the worldwide galaxy of Catholic saints, and he is also on his way to be recognized on the international scene as a Korean historical figure that people should pay attention to. That being said, who was actually Kim Taegån, this man who lived in the first half of the 19th century when Christianity was officially banned in Chosōn, Korea? There is a kind of official and more or less a graphical version that you can find everywhere, beginning with a Wikipedia page in not less than 28 languages. So in a few words, Kim Taegån was born in a Catholic family in the Chungcheong province. He studied in Macau and Manchuria from 1836 to 1845, so basically he was a seminarian. So he was trained by the Paris Foreign Mission Society, the MEP in French. He was then ordained as a priest in 1845 in Shanghai. He was then arrested in 1846 in Hubei province. So he went back to Korea and then he was arrested a few months later. So he was executed in Seoul 3 months later. And he was finally canonized in 1984, meaning that he became a saint. And interestingly, he also became a UNESCO Moral Heritage Person, so a Sege Kenyam in Modern Korean, in 2021 for the bicentenary of his birth. So there are only 3 Korean historical figures that are recognized as moral heritage person by UNESCO. You have Jung Yak-yong, you have Ho-jun, and Kim Taegån. So he's a very particular person. There is, however, another way to understand the story of Kim Taegån with this map. Kim Taegån was one of the first 2 Koreans to be trained as seminarians during a decade in the mid-19th century. But actually, Kim Taegån never went to seminary, strictly speaking. In the early 1840s, he was based in Manchuria, where there was no seminary. And he was studying theology with a French missionary. But he actually spent much time on the road between China and Korea. And it thus became an additional link between Chinese and Korean communities, and also with French missionaries who painfully tried to sneak into the Korean peninsula. In December 1844, Kim Taegån was ordained as a deacon in northeast China. And then he spent 4 months in Seoul, or Hanyang, or Hansong, where he drew his map of Korea and prepared the entry of his French bishop. Then Kim Taegån headed for Shanghai on a Korean junk, where he met his bishop. And he was ordinated to priesthood in August 1845. And then he returned to Korea. He explored the coast of the Hubei province and to complete his map, but he was soon arrested. He was sent to trial and then executed, more for treason and contact with foreigners than for his Catholic faith. From this perspective, I argue that Kim Taegån was not just a clergyman who met a martyr's death. He should rather be considered as a go-between who acted as a knowledge broker and an interpreter, and just a broker. I even would tend to call him a religious smuggler for a contraband religion. So this concept of contraband religion, I use it from a French book called Contraband Religions by Henri de Roux in the 1970s, and also from Western missionaries, French missionaries, who called themselves smuggle goods in this time in China and Korea. As for the concept of go-betweens, it has been much used by scholars in the last decades to excavate and analyze a category of person that historically played a central role in the circulation of knowledge and globalization. I do not have time here to present the existing scholarship on this concept. Let me just say that this concept of go-between has made it possible to better understand the rise of Catholicism in the 4 parts of the world by demonstrating that European missionaries were always dependent on a set of local actors and that they couldn't act without them. a good example of that is the book Go-Betweens and the Colonization of Brazil by Alida Metcalfe that heavily influenced my work. In the case of Chosōn Korea, previous scholarship has focused on the significance of local actors, especially in the absence of foreign missionaries until the 1830s. But it was more on an hagiographic purpose, meaning that we did it alone with the help of God and not with the help of missionaries. And the concept of go-betweens is curiously absent in this scholarship. So I'm going to use it. And Kim Taegån was precisely one of those go-betweens, and it was as such that he drew his map of Korea in 1845. This map was much used by Westerners, meaning Europeans and Americans, until the opening of the Chosōn Kingdom in the 1880s, and it then fell into oblivion. One copy was first rediscovered in 1978, in the French National Library, the BNF. So you have this copy here, and then 5 other copies were rediscovered until 2020. And among this map, there is the supposed original was discovered in 2019. And recent scholarship on this topic is now following the idea that this map on the right this new map on the right is the original map. I will, however, refute this idea later in my presentation. Let me now briefly show you these 6 maps. They were drawn in the 1840s, and some of them, the 3 of them, were drawn in the 1840s and 1850s, and they're all preserved in the French National Library. So you have the oldest one discovered in 1978, the supposed original one, and another. And then we have also 3 other copies. A 4th copy from the 1860s. One is also preserved in the French National Library. Another one from 1865 is now preserved in the MEP, so the Paris Foreign Mission Society archives. And interestingly, a last one is preserved in the US, in the US National Archives and Record Administration. And it was drawn in 1868. So you have 6 maps, but probably the others were probably preserved somewhere or lost. What I now wanted to show is that so this map of Kim Taegån is usually not considered as part of or as an element of Korean cartography. It is usually classified as a Western map of Korea because it was written in a Western language. But I would rather tend to think that it is an hybrid map because it was never fully Korean nor Western. It was drawn by a Korean man. It was the first map drawn by a Korean man in a European language. So what I would like to show in my presentation is that there was an hybridization of Korean and Western knowledge in this map. And I also would like to go beyond the dichotomy of a traditional Korean cartography and a modern Western cartography. And so in my presentation, I will highlight the fact that this map shows that there was a making of a Catholic clandestine cartography in Korea and East Asia through a reappropriation of Korean Catholic cartographic knowledge. And this map also highlights the significance of go-betweens in the history of Korean Catholicism. So to present this map, I will develop 3 points in my presentation. First, I will present the cartographic knowledge on Korea in the early 19th century. Then I will present the making of this map of Korea, Kim Taegån. And then, last point, I will show the different uses of this map of Korea and the problem with the supposed original map. So let me begin with the first part, the first point, the cartographic knowledge on Korea in the early 19th century. First, let me start with Korean maps, a few words on Korean maps. So until the 17th century, Korean maps were mostly classified documents. They were mostly administrative maps, and they were used for administrative and defense purposes. Of course, there were also maps produced by private persons, but they were not as detailed as the administrative maps because the government was, how to say, was feared that this map could go abroad and be used against Koryo or Chosōn. And then in the 18th and 19th century, there was a number of new maps produced on royal orders, a high number of maps produced in the 18th century and the 19th century. But there was also a growing number of private works, meaning not by officials, but by private persons. And these maps produced by private persons sometimes outperformed official maps. And the best example, I guess you all know, is the maps of Kim Jong-ho, with, for example, the best known map of Kim Jong-ho, the Taedong Yeojido in 1861, which is far better than the maps produced by the government. And Kim Jong-ho was someone basically almost totally unknown. We know basically nothing about him, except that it was not an official. It was not an official. There were also some Western influence on Korean cartography in the Chosōn period. So there were Korean adaptations of Jesuit maps that were produced in the late Ming and early Qing period in China. So there are quite a few of these maps, but I just wanted to show one world map, which is not well known, but was recently rediscovered in Korea. So it was a world map of Pak Jong-sol, which is now preserved in the Yecheon Museum. So it is based on a Jesuit map of the early 17th century. And I would like here to thank a colleague from Seoul National University, So Jin Hyung, who let me pay attention to this map. In terms of Western influence on Korean cartography, some scholars have pointed some Western influence on a genre of wall map called Chonhado, so map of the world in the 18th century. So this map shows Buddhist influence, but some scholars would like to show that there was also Western influence. Well, I'm not a specialist on this topic, so we'll not go any longer, but it's a possibility. Then in the 19th century, there was an anti-Christian paranoia, as you all know, but there was also a necessity for the Korean government to better understand the outer world. And in this context, a number of maps were produced on the map of the world in this period with Western influence. And one example is precisely Kim Taegån. Not the map I will show you today, but as I mentioned earlier, Kim Taegån was arrested in 1846 while he was preparing his map, but so he was sent to Seoul or Hanyang for his trial. And during his trial, his judge wanted him to translate an English world map and make 2 copies of his map in colors. And Kim Taegån also wrote a compendium of geography in Korean or in classical Chinese, we don't know. Anyway, and interestingly, this map, or I would say a fake world map of Kim Taegån, was discovered in the Korean Christian History Museum of Sungsil University. Well, actually, I say that it is a fake map because I don't think that Kim Taegån would have drew a map like that. And this map was discovered in the 1920s, exactly when there was the beatification of the first Korean martyrs in Rome. So there was a market for fake artifacts in this colonial period, and so there are a number of fake Catholic artifacts also. So I'm pretty sure it's a fake one. I don't think he would have drew a map like that. Anyway, so now if we come to Western knowledge on Chosōn Korea in this period, I will use a concept from a scholar named Van Schendel, who said that for Westerner, Chosōn Korea was a geography of ignorance. If you look at early 17th century maps, Korea was still an island, and then it slowly became a peninsula. But at least in the late 18th and even in the 19th century, you have, in most maps, you have very few place names. You can see on this map on the right, you have very few place name. And the capital of Korea is not Seoul, it's Kinkitao, which is the Chinese pronunciation of Gyeonggi-do. And you know, it's located right in the middle of Korea, not on the west coast. So it's a geography of ignorance. So why was there a geography of ignorance until the 19th century? There were actually three categories of Western maps of Korea at the time. These maps were mostly based on translations of Chinese and Japanese works, and these Chinese and Japanese works were based on old Korean sources of the early Chosōn period. And most were based on this kind of maps you can find in the Xinjiang Donggukgyeoji Seongnam, so the complete conspectus of the territory of the eastern country. In the so the first edition was in 1481, and the updated edition was in 1531. So basically, Korea at the time looked like had a rectangular form, a rectangular shape. And this rectangular shape, you find it also in Western map of Korea. And then you had new data added by Western explorers from the late 18th century on. If now we look briefly at these three categories of maps, so the first category, what I would call the first category, was based on a map of Bourguignon d'Anville, who was the geographer of the French king Louis XIV. And this map was based on a Sino-Jesuit atlas called the Huangyu Quanlantu of 1718. And this map was the most used, copied, and revised map of Korea in Europe until the mid-19th century. The map I showed you on the previous slide was not this one, but this one. Yeah, this one. So this map on the right is a kind of copy of this map of Bourguignon d'Anville. So then there is a second category of Western maps, which were drawn by German Orientalists in the early 19th century. These maps were based on Japanese maps, and you also find the rectangular shape of Korea. And these maps were mainly used by Western Orientalists and naval officers in Europe and in the US. For example, the Commodore Perry, who opened Japan in 1853, basically used this map of Philip von Siebold, and this map is now preserved in the Library of Congress in Washington. But this kind of maps produced by German Orientalists were not used by French missionaries. So they used mostly the map of d'Anville, at least in the 1840s. We have many copies. And then there's a third category of Western map, and this category is the nautical charts of the late 18th century and 19th century. So these maps were based, of course, on coastal surveys, and in this map, usually you have very few place names in the inland. So, for example, you have this map here on the right of the screen, which is a French nautical chart of 1848, which is based on a survey done in 1846, a survey that had a consequence to be the execution of Kim Taegån. And if you look at this map, you still have this kind of rectangular shape, but you have a very precise depiction of the coast. It's even better than the old map of the first two categories, but you see that the shape of Korea is very different from the actual shape, and you have no place name in the inland. Even the capital isn't mentioned. So it is in this context that the map of Korea by Kim Taegån was drawn, And since this nautical chart was very rare in the 1840s, so Kim Taegån has to use other maps. So and now I come to my second point, the making of the map of Korea. So there was a close link between Catholicism and geographical knowledge, because maps were necessary for evangelization in distant lands, in Korea and elsewhere. So missionaries produced maps for centuries and centuries. And in East Asia, Jesuits were the first to produce maps since the 17th century onwards, mostly in China, but also elsewhere. And as for the MEP, the Paris Formation Society, they started to draw a map of East Asia since the 1830s. Now, if we look at a map produced by the Paris Formation Society, here you have the mission fields of the MEP. Basically, until the 1820s, so the MEP were based in southwest China, so Sichuan, Guizhou, and Yunnan. So it was also based in Vietnam, in Siam, or nowadays Thailand, and also in South India. But then in the 1830s, 40s, and 50s, the Vatican gave the MEP a lot of new mission fields. So all these new mission fields in green. And so you have all of this Northeast Asia. And basically there was, in France, there was, and both in the West, there was very scarce knowledge about, geographical knowledge about Northeast Asia and Korea. So they needed maps, and new maps, accurate maps. And so it is in this context that Kim Taegån drew his map of Korea. And this map is actually one of the first maps. Sorry, there is a S that is missing. So one of the first maps produced by the MEP. I say by the MEP because Kim Taegån was not a MEP missionary, because he was trained by the MEP, and as a Korean man, he could not be a member of this society, but he was trained, so he was like a member of the society. And this map actually illustrates the European adaptations of Asian maps, but we have very few information about the making of this map. Basically, we only know one thing. Only Kim Taegån mentioned in one letter to the procurator of the MEP in Macau, his name is Libois, in a letter of April 7, 1845, that I'm sending you a map of Korea. So in Latin, so he wrote in Latin, so it was a Carta Coreæ, and that's all. So we know nothing else. I'm sending you a map of Korea. And actually, well, it's very frequent, actually, when you look at this European adaptation of Asian maps in other contexts, in China and Vietnam and Japan, you have frequently this kind of problems that you have very few information about the making of this map. So it's a hard work to find out the reality. So I'll try to show you what are my hypotheses. So why and how drawing this map? The first point is that Kim Taegån in 1842 spent several months with the French Navy. So he was on a ship of the French Navy from February 1842 to September. And he spent quite a lot of time with a cartographer. And we know from his letters lately in 1844 that he spent some time correcting Western maps of Manchuria. So he was very interested in cartography, that's for sure. He was also very interested in history of China and Korea. But my question is here, did Kim Taegån take the initiative of drawing his map of Korea? I do have some doubts, and I will show you why. One of the reasons lies in this French missionary, Ferréol, who was the vicar apostolic of Korea. A vicar apostolic in the French, in the Catholic terminology, is a name for a bishop in mission fields where you don't have any diocese. And so he was the vicar apostle of Korea since 1843, but as you may know, it was very difficult to enter Korea at the time, and he was waiting in Manchuria for a good opportunity. And so there was another problem with Ferriol, is that he had a very poor knowledge of Korean language, and it was even worse in Chinese. He was living in Manchuria, but he didn't want to learn Chinese. So basically, he had to rely every day on go-betweens, Chinese go-betweens and Korean go-betweens. And on the Korean side, he could only rely on two Korean seminarians, so Kim Taegån and the other one, Choi Yang-up. But actually, Ferriol considered that Choi Yang-up was, in his own turn, he was a zero, and Kim Taegån was the only one to be able to travel alone and to sneak into Korea. So it was in this context that Ferriol sent Kim Taegån to the Sino-Korean border in 1842, 43, and 44. So basically, Ferriol sent him 3 times to Pianmen. So Pianmen is the gate on the Chinese side of the border, and he also went once to Oiju in 1842. And also in 1844, Ferriol sent him to Gyeongwon, so on the other side of the border. And as you may know, there were yearly markets in Pyongyang, Eju, and Gyeongwon at the time. So precisely, he went there to meet Korean Catholics and see what were the opportunities to enter Korea safely. And basically, he came to the conclusion that it would be very difficult to enter Korea through these 2 paths. And Ferriol then had another solution. Said, well, I'm going to enter Korea not through the road, the northern road, but through the sea, and I will go from Shanghai. Because, as you may know, in the early 1840s, at the end of the First Opium War, Shanghai was opened to Western influence, and so the British were first to arrive there after 1842. Basically, it was a good point, a good entry point to go to Korea, but it was not easy. So then Ferriol and Kim, they all needed a map of Korea because, well, Kim Taegån left Korea when he was 15 years old, so basically had quite a limited knowledge about his country. And Ferriol basically knew nothing about Korea except the maps of Bourguignon-d'Anville. And it was actually quite common at this time among missionaries and explorers to rely on local people to collect informations and local maps. So it's not clearly written in the sources, but I'm pretty sure that Ferriol wanted Kim Taegån to draw this map. And what we know is that Ferriol sent Kim Taegån to Korea through Pianmen and Oiju to prepare his arrival. So he had to go to Seoul or Hanyang, and then to buy a junk, and then from Seoul to go to Shanghai, and then to bring back. So it was in this context that Kim Taegån went to Korea from January to April 1845. So he stayed there for 4 months, but it was not a very nice journey. Let me quote a passage from one of his letters to Libois, the procurator in Macau, dated March 27, 1845. And I use the translation of Brother Anthony, which is a well-known person in our current studies field. Maybe he's here, I don't know. So basically, this letter says, I quote, "My chest, stomach, and back hurt so much that I couldn't stand it, as if the 5 inner organs were blocked. Sometimes it hurt badly, then got a little better. Well, I am better now, but my body is weak, and I cannot write or do anything else I want. For the last 20 days, I even have been suffering from eye disease." So basically, it was the situation until late March, from January to March. So in this context, so Kim Taegån was physically unable to draw his map alone. So he has to rely on his own go-betweens, not just because he was physically unable to do that alone, but because he left Chosōn Korea when he was age 15, so it was 9 years ago. And during his stay in Seoul, he stayed hidden, and nobody knew he was there. Even his own mother was not aware that he was there. So only a few people know that he was there. And so he didn't have direct access to any documents. So he needed local people, local Christians to help him. And we know that one of the main people who helped him, I will call him a go-between also, was Hyun Sung-moon, a person from a Jongin family of Seoul. So it was a several generation Catholic family. And he was a guide for Kim Taegån, and he followed him everywhere, and even until Shanghai in 1845. So basically, I'm pretty sure that Hyun Sung-moon, who also died as a martyr in 1846, did much to help Kim Taegån with the drawing of his map. And probably Hyun Sung-moon also helped him to find the model of the map of Korea. We know that in Chosōn Korea, maps circulated through literary networks and not through bookstores. There were not really bookstores in Korea at the time. So they circulated through literary networks and their personal library. And we know from the records of the MEP that the model map of this map of Korea was an official map. The French missionary don't say which map is it, but they say it is an official map. And in the last couple of years, there were a number of, several research on this model of a map of Korea. So there were several hypotheses, but the best hypothesis is that this map, the model map was the Paldo Chondo, so the complete map of the 8 provinces, a map from the early 18th century, which is now preserved in the Yeonnam University Museum near Daegu. So here I would like to mention the name of Dr. Kim Jong-un from the Northeast Asian History Foundation, who found this map. So he wrote 2 articles on this map, and basically I think that they are the 2 best articles now in Korean on this map. I also have one article. I recently published one article on this map in French, so, but not yet in English. Anyway. So now, what are the characteristics of this map of Kim Taegån? First, it was a map designed for French missionaries. So you don't find a number of things you usually find in Korean maps. So usually in Korean maps, you have a lot of annotations in the sea or around Korean Peninsula, but here you have no annotations. You don't find any colors, like in Korean maps. Usually you have a lot of colors in Korean maps. Another interesting point is that this map is the most accurate and detailed map of Korea in a Western language in the 1840s. You find up to 546 place names in certain copies, not in all. In certain copies, you only have 300 place names. And it is also the first map with Korean pronunciation of place names only. And here I would like to point out a quite interesting detail, is that it is in this map that you find the earliest mention of Seoul, written Seoul. You can't find a previous earlier mention of Seoul written like that. For example, Hendrik Hamel in his journal, one journal, wrote SIOR, so it was different. and the first French missionaries in the 1830s wrote Seoul Sehoul. So basically, Kim Taegån was the first to write Seoul, and then in the following years, French missionaries started to use Seoul. So it's I think quite interesting, and it reminds us that romanization choice done by missionaries a long time ago in Korea and elsewhere are still sometimes followed nowadays. And now another interesting characteristics of these maps is the question of islands. You have more than 300 islands in these maps. So these islands are usually found in Korean maps, especially in the 18th century maps, because on royal order, kings wanted to know very precisely all the islands, and sometimes these islands are bigger than they were considering to the scale, because they had to know the scale and the name of these maps and these islands. And it was also important for French missionaries to know these islands, because these islands, some of these islands were the point of arrival for French missionaries coming by the sea. And then a last interesting characteristics is China and Japan. It's a map of Korea, but you have China and Japan. Actually, when you look at Korean maps of the Chosōn period, most maps do not represent Northeast China and Japan. Look, for example, the map of Kim Jong-ho, the Taedong Gyeoljido of 1861. You don't see China, you don't see Japan. And even in the model map, which is pretty sure the model map of Kim Taegån, here you have nothing in China and you don't see Japan. But here on this map, you have China, you have Northeast China, you also see Tsushima Island, and you see, you have Tsushima Island here also, but you see the coast of Japan. So this information were useful for French missionaries, because some of them were still wanting to enter Korea through the Northern Road, so they needed to know the place names. We need to know the willow palisade that you had here. And at that time in the 1840s, and especially in 1846, missionaries were wanted to enter Japan through Korea. So they needed to know where was Japan. So now I will move to my third part, because I think I'm already speaking for 40 minutes and I think I have to hurry a little bit. So my last point is the uses of this map of Korea and the problem with this so-called original map. So as I mentioned earlier in my presentation, there are two series of this map of Korea. So first series of map were drawn in the 1840s and 1850s, and the second one in the 1860s. Basically, when you look at the maps, the early maps of the 1840s and 50s, basically you only can see urban centers and rivers. And in the maps of the 1860s, you not only have urban centers and rivers, and even more numerous, but you also have a name of seas and mountains. You have also a location of shipwrecks by Westerners. You also have the place of arrival of missionaries. And in some of these maps, you also find the longitudes and the latitudes. So they're much more precise. In theory, so it shows an accumulation of geographical knowledge. So this is something you find in a number of maps in Korea and China and Vietnam and elsewhere also. But I think it's important here, each copy of this map was not just an updated version of the previous maps, since you can see an evolution of a romanization in each map. The romanization is somehow different. And I have also a contra-intuitive finding, is that the maps produced in the 1860s do not always reflect a new knowledge compared to the early copies. This is what I'm going to show in 2 minutes. Then concerning these uses of this map, there were 4 kinds of uses: religious, military and diplomatic, academic and scientific, and finally political. So I'm going to briefly present these 4 uses. So let me start with these religious uses. First, Kim Taegån brought his map with him to Shanghai in mid-1845. So he was in Seoul, so he left from Incheon and then arrived in Shanghai in May or late May, early June 1845. And then he sent his map and a number of letters to Macau after he left Shanghai it was in September 1845. You have to think that at the time there was no courier post service for private persons, especially for missionaries. So missionaries and Kim Taegån, they had to write their letters. Sometimes they write several letters, and then they sent these letters at the same time. And from Korea to Macau, so there was 2 possibilities: to bring his letter to Shanghai or to send his letter through a diplomatic mission to Beijing. But then this map, the letters and the map had to go from Beijing to Macau. So it was very complicated. So it was much easier to take his map with him and his letters, and then to send his map from Shanghai to Macau. So this map was sent to Macau for preservation by the procurator, and then for to be disseminated, copied and disseminated. But we also have to think that Kim Taegån updated his map in 1846, and he produced at least 2 copies of this new map, which were discovered by the Korean authorities. So we don't know where these copies are. But now you already have this issue of the original map. So this map that was sent to Macau, was it the original one, or did Kim Taegån kept the original one with him? I think this not the strongest problem. Anyway, Kim Taegån had several copies: one for him, one for Ferrol, so his bishop, and also one for Macau. So there was at that time at least 3 copies. And this map of Korea was then used by missionaries until the 1870s to sneak into the country. And then it was replaced by new maps and new geographical knowledge. As I mentioned, so this map was used by missionaries, and it was there were some copies in France at the time, since there's now only 1 copy of this map, which is preserved in Paris in the map archives. And this map was drawn in 1865 by a French seminarians, not even in Paris, but in the suburbs of Paris. And I will come back to this map in 1 or 2 minutes. Then the map of Korea was also used for military and diplomatic uses. So I have to remind you that missionary maps were frequently used by naval officers and diplomats at the time, not only this map of Korea, but others. And several copies of the map of Korea circulated in Shanghai since 1845, because there was a French consulate in Shanghai since 1848, and Shanghai was also a port of call for the French Navy. So French missionaries wanted to hit for Korea, so they gave maps to the consul and to the French Navy. So please help us. So that was one. And actually, the 4 copies of the map of Korea that are now preserved in the French National Library were all used by the naval officers and diplomats in the 1850s and 60s, until at least the French expedition of 1866, the so-called Byongin-Yangyo, the Western Disturbance of 1866. And this map was also copied in 1868 by an American midshipman for the US Navy and for an expedition on the northwest coast of Korea after the General Sherman incident of 1866. And which is a point that is very interesting here is that when you compare this map with the map that was drawn in 1865 by the French seminarian in the suburbs of Paris, this map are almost identical, and in terms of the romanization, you have all the same mistakes and mistakes that you do not find elsewhere. So there were necessarily other maps that circulated in China and the West at that time, and which are probably lost or hidden somewhere. Now let me come to the problem with the original map discovered in 2019. I see that quite okay. So in 2019, so this map of Korea by Kim Taegån appeared in the news. You can see a lot of newspaper. So as you can see here, so Kim Taegån 신부 제작 조선 전도 원본 확인. So we found the original map of Kim Taegån 신부, Kim Taegån, Father Kim Taegån. And then you had all these articles, academic articles on this map, thinking that it is the original, but it is quite problematic. So let me show you why. What is the problem? So this map, this supposedly original map, was a copy which was possessed by a French naval officer in the late 1840s, and it was then given to the Ministry of Navy and Colonies, and then to the French National Library. And there are two proofs that it would be the original. One is that an obscure manuscript catalog at the French National Library mentions that it is the original. I have been unable to find it. I have asked Korean scholars to give me the proof, show me the manuscript, and I'm still waiting. It has been a year, so I'm still waiting for the originals of the proof. And the librarian, also I asked the librarian at the BNF, and they say they don't know, or they just say that the what is in the manuscript catalog is online, and online you have nothing on this supposed original thing. And then there was an handwriting analysis by a Korean man with the I think the president of a graphology association, and saying that it is exactly the same writing. So there are the two proofs that it would be the original. But I have several counter-arguments about that. A first problem is that in this map, you don't see Pyongyang and Daegu. So you have the Pyongan province, because you have a lot of small urban centers, but you don't see Pyongyang. And then Gyeongsang-do, you have a lot of even villages, but you don't see Daegu. The problems is that Pyongyang and Daegu were provincial capitals, and I don't think that a Korean man who was very interested in cartography could have omitted two provincial capitals, and especially Pyongyang, because Pyongyang was the main urban center between Uju at the Sino-Korean border and Seoul. And at that time in 1845, missionaries were still thinking to go to Korea from Uju to Seoul, and they necessarily had to cross Pyongyang. And Kim Taegån made this experience in 1845 because when he entered Korea, so he went to Pyongyang and he stayed there for a week. So he was there for a week in January 1845, and then he drew his map 2 or 3 months later. So I cannot imagine that he may have missed this point, which was so central. It's impossible. Then Another problem is the use of French in this map. So you have a few elements in French. So basically the place name, so you can remember the difference between French and Latin letters. But you have some place name with the French. And the problem is that at the time, Kim Taegån was forbidden to write and speak in French by missionaries. They wanted him only to write and speak in Latin. And so you don't find any letter of Kim Taegån in French. So Kim Taegån always used Latin. And the thing is that there is a Latin copy of Kim Taegån's map, which was drawn in 1860, now is the French National Library. And the thing is that French missionaries would never translate a French map into Latin. It's nonsense. And my idea is that this was actually a French map designed for naval officers who didn't understand Latin. So, and then a third point is that the question of romanization used by Kim Taegån in 1845. When you compare, the writing of Kim Taegån, the romanization he used in his letters, it is very different from the romanization in the original map, but it is almost identical to the romanization in the Latin map of 1860s. And last point is the question of graphology or handwriting. I'm not a graphologist, but actually I compared the letters of Kim Taegån in 1845 and his map, the original, and I find that is quite different. I mean, perhaps for a Korean man, it may be identical, but I mean, for a Frenchman who has been doing archival research for 25 years, for me, it's very different. 1 or 2 minutes and I'm done. Lastly, academic and scientific uses. So the map of Kim Taegån was criticized by French geographers in the 1850s, saying that it was a non-scientific work. But this map of Korea was widely used, copied in French in Western academic journal, books, and encyclopedia of the 19th century. For example, in English, you find it in the book of William Griffiths, Korea, the Urban Nation, and it is mentioned as one of the most reliable map of Korea. And then last point, the political uses of this map of Korea. It is used since the late 20th century to show that you have Dokdo on this map. Dokdo는 Ulitang, so it's a part of our territory. And in the later copies on the 1860s, you also have the mention of the Mari Orientale, so the Tonghe, so the East Sea. So these maps of Kim Taegån are used for nowadays political uses and the struggles with Japan on the name of the sea and the possession of Dokdo. So now let me come to the conclusion. So I've been very long. So I would say that this map of Korea was an hybrid map. It was both a missionary map and a kind of European adaptation of an Asian map. It shows that there was no superiority of the Western cartography or the Korean cartography at this period. This map also provides another perspective on Kim Taegån. It was not just a saint, but a go-between. And finally, this map of Korea could be considered also as an element of Korean cartography, because in a certain sense, it shows the evolution of Korean cartography in the late Chosōn, and it shows the evolution of the private map making, in late Chosōn. So thank you, and I'm very sorry for speaking so long.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Roux. This was such a fascinating talk, and you can see how much our audience was engaging and asking a lot of questions today. I hope to read your book very soon and use it in my class.
In English, so yeah.
Yeah, so you're publishing this book in English, right?
Yes.
Okay, good. Good. Well, thank you so much. And also thanks to our audience for joining us today. We'll have another Premodern Korea lecture series in November. And our next speaker is Dr. Graham Reynolds. I hope you'll be able to join us again in November. But thank you again, and see you again soon.
Thanks again for the invitation, and thanks to all for coming today.